So another, perhaps more radical way of looking at some of the inferences that we make is the idea that in certain situations, the use of rapid heuristics can actually be considered much more effective than if we take a more kind of conscious or deliberate effort to come to a decision. And this perspective is really well popularized in Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink, which, as a side note, not all of the evidence that he presents in there is necessarily that compelling or well supported. But some examples that might illustrate this use of kind of heuristics rather than a kind of conscious deliberation is the idea that if you show art historian experts a genuine and a fake chorus, this is basically the Greek statue pictured on the left here, these expert historians can tell you almost instantly that one is genuine, one is fake, despite not necessarily being able to exactly articulate why one is fake and one is genuine. And this is something that can kind of reflect almost an implicit knowledge that we have. So we don't necessarily have access to the rules that we're using to discriminate and determine or make this inference of this one's fake, this one's genuine, but we're able to do it kind of unconsciously or implicitly. Another good example is the case study of Michael Riley, who was a radar operator in the British Navy. So this was during one of the Gulf Wars. And so the Gulf War was fighting against Iraq. And his job was basically to look at this radar and identify if there was an incoming enemy missile. And the difficult part of this job is that there's not much of a difference between an incoming enemy missile as it signals on the radar and an American fighter jet. They essentially look the same. And he ended up seeing this signal that came in. I had to make a very tough decision of, I'm not sure if this is a fighter jet that wasn't meant to be a fighter jet in the air at the time, or is it a missile that's coming to destroy their boat. And he made the decision to fire some surface-to-air missiles that would take this thing out of the sky. And it's like a nerve-wracking decision of, you know that you might be sending this off to destroy a fighter jet that's coming in. Yet he couldn't explain why he felt so fearful about those blips that were coming in, and why he seemed to be kind of convinced that the blip was a missile and not a friendly plane. And this is an example. It wasn't until several years later that the British Navy discovered that he had sort of unconsciously picked up on some subtle discrepancy in the timing of the radar signal that was appearing there. So there was something like a sort of small millisecond difference in the way that signal was coming across. And again, it's just something that you have a kind of implicit access to. Now, it's true that not all of the kind of automatic or instant judgments that we make are necessarily going to be correct, of course. And it turns out that there's at least a couple of conditions that tend to be important for determining whether you actually make rapid or accurate inferences. So the first one is the level of expertise that a person has. So if we look at the example of detecting a fake or a genuine chorus and the missile detection, in both examples we're looking at individuals who are expert, that they have implicit knowledge and understanding of all the sort of possible parameters and would likely detect subtle differences. So in the absence of some degree of expertise, then maybe making rapid heuristic judgments is very unlikely to lead to accurate inferences. The second factor is whether the task or the decision that we're making can be decomposed, or basically can we break this problem down into a series of simpler choices or components. So if we can break it down into lots of different components and then evaluate each of these, maybe that would make sense. We would benefit from taking our time on this. But however, for a lot of things, the judgment needs to be based on a kind of holistic appreciation of everything together. So if you think of, again, I'm going for a sporting example, if I asked you how beautiful is this soccer goal that is scored, there's not really like a rubric and a checklist that you could go through to look at the different elements of that action there's just a general appreciation that you could bring to interpret or to make a judgment of the beauty of that particular action. So it turns out that when decisions are really easy to decompose and we're non-experts, those are situations where it makes sense to actually deliberately and consciously weigh up all the pros and cons of the decision. If we're an expert in the domain and we can't break the problem down into different little parts and evaluate it, then probably in those situations it makes much more sense to make automatic decisions. Okay, so the previous two examples that I've given you are a little bit kind of anecdotal in nature, but there is a line of research and theoretical approach that is referred to as the unconscious thought advantage, that argues that actually a lot of the time unconscious processing is important to help us to make effective decisions. So to understand this, we can think of in common sense terms when we're trying to make a decision. One approach that you could adopt is that we want to just simply think hard about the decision at hand. So we want to engage in conscious, deliberative thought. But another kind of common piece of advice is that maybe you're trying to make a difficult life choice. Maybe you should sleep on it. So not necessarily think about the problem at hand, but just take some time to have that kind of thought process ticking on unconsciously in the background, and then maybe the next day it'll just sort of come into your mind which is the correct decision. So if you imagine that maybe you want to book a holiday and you're torn between two destinations that you want to go to, maybe you just kind of defer your choice until the next day, and when you wake up in the morning and you think about it again, it just pops into your head that this is the place that I want to go. And this is essentially the argument of the unconscious thought advantage, is that when we engage in deliberating about something without necessarily directing our attention towards it, that we can basically allow us to unconsciously process the information in a way that is going to lead us to make a better decision. So in other words, if you've got lots of complex bits of information, if we take our mind off of this, in the background we can just be unconsciously processing all of those bits of information that effectively lead us to make a better decision later. And this unconscious thought advantage is argued to be much more pronounced and has a benefit for us when we're making these complex decisions. So when we've got to combine these multiple aspects of information. So a really famous study that illustrated this effect was reported in the journal Science, again the most prestigious flagship journal that's out there, by Dijksterhuis et al. In this task, ostensibly it's a very simple task that you're given. You've got 4 cars and you've got to make a choice which of these 4 cars is the best one. Now the 4 cars vary in the percentage of positive, neutral and negative attributes that describe them. So one car, 75% of the attributes are kind of positive, another car 50% of them are positive, another car 25% of them are positive. Now we then have different conditions where the number of attributes that we're given, so the number of elements of information describing the car vary. So there's a simple condition where we're just given 4 bits of information about the car, and a more complex decision where we're given 12 aspects of information about the car. And again, we've got one correct choice here. We should be choosing that car that has the majority of positive attributes towards it. So they then, in this experiment, vary. After people are given this information about the car, they vary what you've got to do next. So in one condition, we engage in conscious deliberation. So you're told you've got several minutes to think about your choice, to weigh up this information and choose which one is best. In another condition, the unconscious thought one, you're given a distractor. So this is a task to take your mind off of the decision at hand, and in this case they're given a series of anagrams that they need to solve, and then after several minutes of doing these anagrams, they're asked, can you make your decision of which of these cars do you think is the best one? And what you've got plotted on the left hand side of the graph here is the performance in the simple task where you've only got a few attributes, and there's not really much difference between performance in the conscious and the unconscious performance. The conscious thought is a little bit better, so around about just over sort of 50, nearly 60% of people are choosing the car with the best attributes. The strongest effect though is when you're given this more complex, there's multiple bits of information coming in, and you've got to weigh up all of these to work out which one has on average the most positive attributes. You see this strong unconscious thought advantage that appears here. So it seems to be the case that unconscious thought is really effective. So 60% of people get it right after the unconscious thought, whereas it's as low as only like 1 in 5 are picking the right one when you've allowed to kind of consciously deliberate on your decision. So that's a pretty striking dramatic effect that occurs there. And you also see equivalent effects in the difference in the attitude that people have towards the desirable and undesirable cars that appear there. So this is pretty strong evidence, it seems, for this unconscious thought advantage. However, there is a lot of attempts to replicate these effects that suggest that maybe this unconscious thought effect is nowhere near as robust and as reliable as it would seem. And certainly on the balance of what I've read, I do not trust the effects and the findings that come out of this. So there's a lot of defense from Dijksterhuis and those that do these unconscious thought experiments that suggest maybe there's moderators, or this effect holds only under certain specific conditions. And it's a very difficult challenge for somebody replicating this to demonstrate that even under all of these conditions, this effect genuinely doesn't happen. So the question is still sort of open out there of whether there are conditions where you can experience this unconscious thought effect, but yeah, my intuition is that it's kind of maybe not one to throw too much money behind. So in the previous slides, we've seen how it's possible for us to make relatively rapid and automatic judgments, and when we're doing this, we can still come to reasonably accurate inferences. What we're going to focus on next is how is it that we are capable of making accurate inferences, and particularly about people's personality, so their traits. How can we make accurate inferences from very thin slices of behavior? Now, thin slicing basically describes this ability for us to find patterns in events based on only taking a very sort of small, narrow window of experience. And generally refers to our ability to then make an inference about the state, the personality traits, characteristics of an individual or a situation, given this kind of minimal information about them. We're going to see the research has shown that the judgments and the inferences that we make based on this thin slice of information is often just as accurate, or sometimes even more so, than judgments based on much more information. So one study that I want to focus on here examines people's judgments or inferences about an individual's personality traits based on having a very brief exposure to seeing their bedroom environment. So in this study by Sam Gosling and colleagues, they took 83 observers or participants to scan. So again, you're having a very brief look at somebody's bedroom environment, and then they asked them to rate what do you think are the personality traits of the individual who occupies this room. So they would rate them according to the big 5 traits of openness to experience, conscientiousness, emotional stability, agreeableness, and extroversion. And they then afterwards compared how well did the people's predictions of the personality traits match up to the self-reported personality traits of the people who actually lived in these rooms. So if you look at the 2 examples here, So these are two very different sorts of rooms. You might think about which one of those is kind of closer to your room. Is it the one that's very neat and organised on the left, or the one bit of a mess on the right hand side? What inferences do you think you could make looking at those two rooms? Well, what would you be able to kind of confidently say about the personality of someone who lives in that room on the left and the person on the right? And as you're doing that, what I'd like you to do is just think of what are the specific cues. So what specific objects or items in there are giving you some sort of insight into the personality trait of the person who might live there. So take a moment to really focus on the details and think about those specific cues and what they're indicating to you. So what is it that they found? Is it the case that we're good at predicting people's personality traits? And the answer is sort of kind of. So what we've got here on this rather complicated bar graph, let me try and simplify it for you. If you look along the x-axis, we've got the 5 different personality traits plotted here, and then we have different coloured bars that represent different versions of the study that they ran during this experiment. So the one that I've just described is illustrated with the bar graphs with the white infill, so the bedrooms in study 2. They also ran the study in a different version where they got people to look at somebody's office space and then rate their personality characteristics from that. In the dark grey bars, they've plotted data from how accurate we are of judging people based on a brief interpersonal interaction with them. And in grey is how good we are predicting someone's personality trait based on it being a long-term acquaintance, so someone we've known for a long period of time. Now, what it's actually plotting along the y-axis is the correlation between your estimate, so participants' estimate of their personality traits, and the actual personality traits of the person. And if we look at what's plotted in white, what sort of stands out the strongest is that those correlations are significantly the highest and strongest for predicting emotional stability and openness to experience. So in other words, based on that insight we can get from looking at the person's room, we can get a really good picture of how open the person is. We can also get a pretty good indicator of their level of emotional stability. But when it comes to understanding their level of extroversion and agreeableness, yeah, not so good. There's a relatively, it's still a significant correlation there. There's a relatively sort of modest. We're not as good at estimating their extroversion and agreeableness as we are at estimating their openness to experience. So in other words, if you want to learn someone's level of extroversion, you should get to know them. But if you want to learn about their openness, an examination of their bedroom would probably be a more useful approach to this. So what exactly are the mechanisms through which we impact or influence our environment in a way that then causes somebody else observing it to gain some insight and draw an inference about the personality trait of the occupants? So in other words, how do we go about knowing someone's personality from the information that's available in the room? And Gosling et al. In their paper broke down some of the inferences that we make into 4 different mechanisms that relate to the nature of the behavior and the trait that we're observing there. You don't need to worry about this, but this is very much based on Brunswick's lens model. So at the first level, one mechanism is that they argue we can have these self-directed identity claims. And these basically refer to the features in our room that we may include to make symbolic statements for our own benefit and to reinforce our own self-views. So things that this might include is extending to university memorabilia. You might include a poster of a band that you really enjoy, or it could be some artifacts that have a personal meaning to you. So like a little lucky memento, or the example that they put in there as a pebble from the beach. So that would be the idea that you would see a pebble from the beach, you would interpret this as manifesting the behavior of this is someone who likes to collect memorabilia, and the underlying disposition of this person, yeah, they're obviously a sentimental person. We have other directed identity claims. So these include objects that we use to make statements to others. So for example, we might want to explicitly communicate our attitudes and values to other people. So in our bedroom, it's not just us that end up spending time there. There are other people that we might invite, and obviously this depends on what stage of your life you're at. But a lot of the time you might invite friends around to hang over. And if you've got friends hanging over there, maybe there's things in our room that we want to put up that communicate an important attitude or value about yourself. So you might want to show that you're someone who's interesting, you're creative, and if you want to do that, you could put up thought-provoking posters. It might be the case that you want to project the fact that you have an ethical conscience. So you could put up, if you go and donate blood, and they give you a sticker that says I donated blood, would put that somewhere visible, with the idea that other people are going to know, they're going to see this, and they'll understand that I'm an ethical and kind, caring person. So again, there might be a lot of overlap with the sort of things that would be displayed for self-directed reasons, but the difference fundamentally is the motivation. Is it the case that you want to put it up to reinforce views for yourself, or because you want other people to notice that you have those values and those views? So the example that they give in there is you might put up a I voted sticker. That indicates the person in this room has voted, and they are underlying dispositions that they're someone that's socially responsible. At the next level, we have these interior behavior residues. So these refer to the physical traces in the environment that indicate past and anticipated behaviors. So one example of this might be, say you go in and there's beanbags that are arranged around in a circle. Now if you do that, an automatic inference is that this is a person who maybe has a lot of social gatherings. So there's a lot of friends that come over and do this. Or alternatively, it might be the way that you organize your CD collection. So you have this organized neatly, alphabetically, this indication that you're either a little bit neurotic or highly conscientious. We then have these exterior behavioral residues. So these refer to remnants of activities that would take place outside of the current location. An example of this might be you go and put a surfboard and a wetsuit that are hanging up, and this is something that would suggest the person is maybe highly sensation seeking or extroverted. Or if you have on your desk, you've got the map of an art gallery that's there, could suggest something that you're a creative and high in openness. It's difficult to always be certain of the motivations behind these cues. And again, many of them could fall into different categories. So for example, the surfboard, if you've got that propped up in the corner, that might reflect exterior behaviors. But then there's also an element of, if you decide to keep it in the room, rather than you could store it downstairs or you could put it in a cupboard out of the way, maybe it's the case that you're using it in a other directed identity claim. So you're using it in a way that you want other people to appreciate how cool you are, that you go and spend your time surfing. So I wouldn't get too hung up on any single one of these mechanisms, being able to define anything according to one of these mechanisms for certain. We can't do that because it depends on the motivation, which we really don't have insight into. But I think it's a useful way of just breaking down what's going on during this process. So what you should focus on is that we've got this underlying disposition on the left-hand side. So what is a dispositional personality trait, such as how sentimental, that's going to manifest itself in some sort of behavior, so something that they actually do. And then this is going to be actually evidenced within the room in some form. So whether that's a pebble, a sticker, the organized workspace, or putting the snowboard there. Now, obviously, when we're making these inferences about the personality of somebody, we're making this inference in the reverse direction. So we're seeing the pebble, judging what behavior this represents, that it represents them collecting memorabilia, and then we're judging the underlying disposition based on this. They also argue that some of these residues can also activate stereotypes and associated traits. So when I talk about a residue, we're just looking at something, some item, some object that's there in the room. So for example, if I looked in there and you see in someone's bedroom that there's a rice cooker that's in there, this might activate stereotypes associated with Asian. That I think, yeah, this is probably an Asian person that lives in this room, and then that could activate an additional set of dispositions that are associated with that stereotype that's been activated. Moving away from this ability to make judgments based on really thin slices, let's just think about, in a more general sense, how do we go about making personality inferences? And we make judgments of people's personality traits all of the time. And these judgments can have really important consequences, both for the way that we interact with and how we treat other people. There's numerous decisions about who it is that we trust, befriend, who do we hire in a job, date, and even marry, largely based on personality judgments. What do we think this person is like? And the consequences of mistakes in these judgments can range from the sort of embarrassing to the disastrous. So they're equally consequential for the person who is being judged. So if you're someone who is constantly deemed to be unreliable, nobody's going to loan you money, even if it's likely that you would actually pay them back. Similarly, your social life and your success in the workplace is going to depend to quite a high degree on other people's judgment of your personality. If they see you as being agreeable, you're much more likely to sort of thrive and be accepted, as opposed to if you're seen to be this disagreeable individual. So this raises an important question regarding how do we go about making accurate personality judgments. So what information and what processes are required for us to be a good judge of another person's personality traits? Now, in order to understand this, the realistic accuracy model is one effort to explain how it is that accurate personality judgments occur. So before going any further, what exactly is it do we mean by accuracy? Because there's several different definitions that you could come up with. So if I think that somebody is highly extroverted, how do I know how accurate my assessment is? How would you go about scientifically evaluating this? And generally, accuracy can be considered by... Okay, let's move away from this ability to make inferences about personality traits from just very small slices of behavior, and let's think about it in a more general sense. So how is it the case that we are able to make an accurate personality judgment about another person? And it's something, we do this all of the time, and they have really important consequences, these evaluations that we make of other people. So they influence the way that we interact with and how we treat other people. A lot of the decisions about who you end up trusting, befriending, hiring, dating, marrying, a lot of these decisions depend quite a lot on the inferences that you make about their personality trait. Do we think that this is someone who is agreeable, conscientious, etc.? And if we're going to make mistakes in these judgments, these can have really important consequences that range from just being maybe a little bit embarrassing to having sort of lifelong disastrous consequences here. The accuracy of these personality judgments are also really consequential for the person that's being judged. So if you're constantly mistakenly judged to be someone who's untrustworthy, disagreeable, then you're probably going to get quite a tough time in your social life, and you'll find it more difficult getting a promotion at work, etc. So the question we're going to focus on next is how do we go about making accurate personality judgments? So what is the information and the processes that are required for us to actually be a good judge of another person's personality traits? And in doing this, one really nice approach I think is called the realistic accuracy model, proposed by David Funder. And this basically tries to explain how is it that we come up with an accurate personality judgment. Now, before we go any further, we need to think of a definition for what do we mean by the term accuracy. So if I say, for example, I think that John is highly extroverted, how do I know how accurate my assessment is of John? How would you go about scientifically evaluating this or kind of quantifying my level of accuracy? And there's a number of different ways that we can actually tackle this accuracy problem. So generally, one of the best approaches to do this is we can evaluate how closely my perception matches the target's own personal judgment of their level of extroversion, say. So if I say that John is highly extroverted, John says that he's highly extroverted, then you say that I've got a pretty good accuracy there. And this is known as self-other agreement. Another criterion is the consensus in people's appraisal. So in other words, does my judgment agree or at least closely match with the judgments that other people are making? And if nobody can agree, then somebody must be mistaken. There must be some degree of inaccuracy here. So if I think that John is extroverted and we ask 10 other people how extroverted is John, they're all like, yeah, he's really extroverted, then we'd say there's good other agreement. Finally, we can judge accuracy on the basis of how well does your judgment of their personality trait predict future behaviors that you would expect to be associated with that particular trait. So in other words, if I think that somebody is extroverted, then my perception, my inference of their extroversion would be accurate if they then go on to display a range of socially outgoing behaviors. So they're very talkative, they've got a wide circle of friends, etc. Whereas it would be less accurate if it turned out that actually the kind of things that they do in their daily life are generally associated with a more introverted. So if they turn out to be very shy, they don't have many friends, etc. So we've got three different types of accuracy that we can define here. So the realistic accuracy model describes some of the processes that we go through in order for an accurate judgment to be achieved. And they argue that there's four things that must happen. And this is really just a kind of absolute common sense approach to the things that are required for us to be able to interpret from someone's behavior, their personality. So at the very first stage, if I think that I'm watching or observing somebody and I'm trying to understand what is the personality trait, at the first level, the person that is being judged by me, they have to actually engage in some behavior that is relevant to the personality trait. So in other words, imagine that someone's really deep down internally, they are someone who's really caring and friendly and kind. They need to express this at some point. So they need to display and express this friendliness and kindness in the way that they behave or interact with others. If they don't display this ever, it's not going to be possible to make an accurate judgment. Now, at the second stage, if we're going to engage, or the person's going to engage in some trait-relevant behavior, it's only going to be informative or useful for the judge if it occurs in their presence. So that's availability. And then the next level, this trait-relevant behavior must actually be detected by the other person. So if I'm trying to judge somebody and they engage in trait-relevant behavior in my presence, I then need to actually pay attention and be focused on their behavior. And if I'm not doing that, then I'm not going to make an accurate judgment. So if someone does a really kind act and picks up a coffee for a friend, so we know that a friend was tired and they really needed one, we're only going to use this information if we're paying attention to this particular exchange or the behavior that's going on. If we don't notice that somebody's bought that coffee for that reason, we're not going to detect it, and we're not going to make a personality judgment. The fourth one is this detected information, if we note it, must be utilized correctly. So if we see this kind act that somebody's engaged in, we must correctly interpret it as being kind or friendly, rather than the alternative is maybe to misinterpret it as being a kind of cynical or manipulative act. That if somebody's just bought a coffee for their boss, one interpretation is they know that their boss is a little bit tired. It's a friendly behavior. A more cynical interpretation is that they're trying to get a promotion and they're doing all that they can to butter up the boss. So again, these four stages here, they don't necessarily describe what does happen in every judgment that we're making, but it describes what is a necessary requirement for accurate judgments to occur. So it's only if we successfully navigate each of these four stages are we in with the chance of making an accurate personality judgment. So you can think of those four as the sort of requirements. Without any of those, you're not going to make an accurate judgment. But we also have factors that are going to determine the degree to which this personality judgment is accurate or not. So in other words, how good or poor is the judgment? So the first of these is we need a good target. So ideally, if you want to make an accurate personality judgment of someone, you want someone who always behaves in a really consistent way. You also want someone who effectively kind of wears their heart on their sleeve. So how they're feeling and thinking is really accurately displayed in the way that they behave and respond. What you don't want is someone who's really self-conscious and someone who's prone to concealing their feelings. So for them, their behavior will be a lot less predictable. So maybe you've got someone who deep down is really shy and introverted, but they are self-conscious of this and they don't like this trait, and instead they try and make up for it by being outgoing. And someone like this would be really difficult to accurately judge. We also need a good trait. So there's certain personality traits that are much easier to make an accurate judgment than others. So one of these, that's probably the most visible, is something such as extroversion. So how talkative a person is relatively easy to judge based on behaviors that you can easily observe. Whereas if I want to detect how neurotic or ruminative or moody someone is, or how prone they are to fantasize, those are details that, or behaviors that are only likely to be expressed kind of much more in private, or they certainly have fewer expressive behaviors associated with them. So certain traits are hard to pick up, other traits are much easier. We then need good information. So this can be broken down into the quantity of information. So in other words, the more information you have, the more you observe someone, the better. So if I observe someone over several different times in different behaviors, I'm going to be much more accurate at making a judgment with common sense. We then have quality. So the quality of information concerns the domains where we're getting our information. So at the very highest level, so top quality information, is me having a face-to-face interaction with somebody. So that's going to give us really rich information and insight into them. But we know we can also make these judgments from much lower quality and impoverished information. So some of the stuff that we've looked at in the thin slices examples, I can make judgments based on somebody's Spotify playlist, their social media page, for example, but it's not going to give me quite as good a quality insight as me spending time talking to them and interacting might do. And then finally, you as the judge, you need to be good. So you need to have a good and accurate ability of viewing this information, so this behavior, and being able to come to an accurate judgment using it. And we know that there are individual differences in how good people are at doing this.